said last class, this whole idea about the presidency, we already have a lot of background. I mean, not only from your history courses, but from our course as well. Because we've talked about the election process at length, which is such a huge part of becoming president. We have looked at how the media, how political parties, how interest groups, all of those things relate to the executive branch. So really, our study of the presidency simply needs to revolve around this idea of presidential power and how presidents use that. The thing is, we've had a dramatic shift. And the presidency of 2016 is most certainly not the presidency that our framers created. So in order to understand presidential power, you kind of have to look and say, well, what have presidents done? Like, what's worked? You know, and you guys didn't look at it last class, but I've got some polls where we kind of look at rankings of presidents. Just tell me, like, who would you expect to be at the top of those public opinion polls? FDR was usually there. George Washington. Everybody loves Washington.
Maybe Lincoln.
Okay, good. Those are pretty consistent, right? Lincoln, FDR, George Washington. Who would you expect to be at the bottom? Nixon, Taft.
Carter.
The ones we can't remember, Carter, potentially. So, and those are pretty consistent. And then you get the weird ones like Reagan will be on the top of the list and the bottom because people feel pretty extreme. You'll find that with Clinton as well. You know, and I'm sure we will. And because, and again, that's kind of good evidence of the polarization that we've started experiencing more and more. So the way we want to start is we're going to look at 3 quotes from 3 people who served as president. And you've actually got their pictures there on your page. So this first quote is a quote from President Lincoln. Who wants to read for me? Shakira, thank you.
I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me an unrestricted right to act. I did understand, however, that my oath to preserve the Constitution to the best of my ability imposed upon me the duty of preserving by every indispensable means that government, that nation of which the Constitution was the organic law. Was it possible to lose the nation and yet preserve the Constitution? I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution due preservation of the nation. Right or wrong, I assume this ground and now avow it. I could not feel that to the best of my ability I had even tried to preserve the Constitution, and I should permit the wreck of the government, country, and Constitution altogether. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me.
Thank you so much. So what we want to consider, you know, all of you mentioned earlier, like several of you said, like Lincoln would be somebody that we would regard as a really great president. So understanding then how he felt about presidential power would be really important for presidents that come after him. So remind me, what time period was Lincoln president?
Civil War.
Okay, during the Civil War, so he was a wartime president, right? We regard him as fairly successful. So, like, in terms of the power that Lincoln has, how does he view his power? Cameron?
He thinks that his power is set out by the Constitution, and he wants to abide by it because, like, he feels like that the things that he's supposed to do, the Constitution basically said that for him, so he's trying to, like, preserve, like, what the country was built on, almost.
Okay. Does he ever see a way that he might violate the Constitution?
Yeah.
Look at this right here. He says, I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution through the preservation of the nation. What does that mean, Chris?
It means that, like, something that, like, normally wouldn't be okay would be okay simply for the fact that he has to do it to, like, preserve the nation and the Constitution.
Yeah. Like, the Constitution isn't worth anything if the country falls apart. It doesn't matter anymore. So then we've got to think about, like, what could Lincoln have done that might have been unconstitutional? Does anybody remember?
He suspended the writ of habeas corpus.
Good. Suspension of the writ of habeas corpus is a great example. So if you remember, the Constitution says that we are all guaranteed the writ of habeas corpus. So if I get arrested, I'll be taken to a judge and told, this is what we're trying you for. Lincoln suspended that. And he said, during a time of war, lock those Southern soldiers up. Take them and hold them. So was it okay for him, in his mind, it was okay for him to do that and violate the law, because in doing so, he was able to preserve the country. So in your little box next to Lincoln, just kind of summarize, Lincoln's perspective on presidential power.
Wait, so the habeas corpus thing is like they get a trial or just telling them
Yeah,
what
you're
they do?
guaranteed that. The benefit of, trial, and we're not just gonna like hold people and detain them.
Without like telling them.
Mhm. What do you think about this?
Yeah, it's not ideal, but it's like he's trying to do what's best for the US. He's trying to do what's best for the country that he leads. Like he's responsible for the country.
So as long as it's best for the country, it's okay.
I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying there's a fine line.
It made you kinda wince. Why did it do that to yours?
Because if it's only good for the country, it could be bad for the rest of the world. So you can do certain things that the Constitution wouldn't be okay with to benefit the US only while
Okay.
hurting others around the world, like the other nations.
Is this ever okay in your own life? Do you ever break a rule because there's like a greater good?
Depends on what it is. Again, there's a fine line.
I mean, it's an interesting moral dilemma though, right? I mean, you have to.
It's also really subjective, so like it might be for the best for some people, but not for others.
Yeah, kinda like what Urte said about like our country versus others. Okay. All right, we have another quote. This quote is from Teddy Roosevelt. What do y'all remember about Teddy?
Bull Moose Party.
Bull Moose Party, good. Okay, kind of aggressive, big stick diplomacy, expansion of the government into environmental policy, expansion of the government into, say it again?
National parks.
Creation of national parks, worker protection, right, where we start to like protect people like with factories and food safety and all kinds of stuff. Okay. Antitrust, very good. So pretty big government. Government doing it, very progressive government. Okay. Who wants to read what Mr. Roosevelt has to tell us? Thanks, Gabby.
Yep. I've tried to adopt the view that what was imperatively necessary for the nation cannot be done by the president unless he provides the specific authorization for it. My belief was that it was not only his right but his duty to do anything that the needs of the nation demanded unless such action was forbidden by the Constitution or by the laws. I did not usurp power, but I did greatly broaden the use of executive power. I acted, whenever and in whatever manner was necessary, unless prevented by direct constitutional or legislative prohibition. The course I followed was regarding the executive as subject only to the people and, under the Constitution, bound to serve the people affirmatively in cases where the Constitution does not explicitly forbid him to render the service.
Okay, thank you very much. So Teddy Roosevelt's taking a different perspective. How is what he says different? How is his view different than what Lincoln's was? Go ahead, Megan.
He's saying that you should still follow the Constitution at all costs and everything, and so he's still giving more power to the presidency because he can do whatever he wants besides those things, but he's still acknowledging that it's forbidden.
Okay. I think that's important. Yes, he says, I did broaden the use of executive power, but right here he says, I'm bound to serve the people affirmatively in cases where the Constitution does not explicitly forbid him to render the service. So this is like when you get in trouble and your response to your parents is, but you didn't say I couldn't do that. So if you didn't tell me I can't and it's for the good of the people, I'm going. If the Constitution says no or the law says no, then I won't. But if it's a gray area or it's an untouched area and it's going to make our country better, it's going to help our people, then I'm going. How does Teddy Roosevelt go on that list of presidents? Isn't his head also carved in Mount Rushmore?
Yes.
Yeah, he's on those lists for sure. People definitely regard him, and larger than life personality, right? I mean, definitely a huge part of our kind of cultural image of what a president is or could be. So the last quote we're going to look at is from Taft, who Urte mentioned earlier, who he thought would be on the bottom of the list of great presidents.
What I hear, like,
That's what you hear.
I'd like to read it out from.
No, you're absolutely right. What do y'all remember about Taft?
Um, not much.
Do you remember anything?
Wasn't he fat?
Mhm. He was very, very big man.
Stuck in his bathtub.
He did. He got stuck in his bathtub.
He had something about pants. I feel like he had something about pants.
Somebody in my last class said that 3 people could fit into 1 pair of his pants.
Oh.
Yeah.
So maybe that's
Oh, wow.
some teacher must have told that story. So yeah, so this is what we remember. Now, Taft, actually, you guys carried on the trust busting. My understanding is that there was more like monopoly regulation and things done under Taft than there were done under FDR or Teddy Roosevelt. So see, but what we remember about Taft is that he was fat. Okay,
So sad.
he is going to go on to serve on the Supreme Court. Okay. So let's see what Taft has to tell us about the Constitution. Who wants to read for me? Thanks, Jordan.
The true view of the executive function is, as I conceive it, that the president can exercise no power which cannot be fairly and reasonably traced to some specific grant of power, or justly implied and included within such express grant as proper and necessary to its exercise. Such specific grant must be either in the federal Constitution or in an act of Congress passed in pursuance thereof. There is no undefined residuum of power. The grants of executive power are necessarily in general terms in order not to embarrass the executive within the fields of action plainly marked for him. But his jurisdiction must be justified and vindicated by affirmative constitutional or statutory provision or its affiliates.
Thank you very much. All right. His words are not super bold, right? But it's pretty clear right here. His jurisdiction must be justified and vindicated by affirmative constitutional or statutory provision, or it does not exist. Nikita, put that into like regular people words.
He's saying that if it's not written out in the Constitution, that they cannot have it.
Yeah. So this is the rule follower. This is the person that says, I am limited to what I have been prescribed to do. If I've not been granted specific authority, then that's not my job. And it's interesting that he goes on to serve on the Supreme Court, right? He goes on to be an interpreter of the Constitution. So we've talked about these men's relationship in terms of like how people regard them historically, the time period in which they were president, right? And then their attitude. So there's obviously a lot of factors then that go into what it is that makes a great president. So if you guys will flip your paper over to the back of this first page, question 1 says, how does the time and the circumstance through history dictate or affect a president's use of power? How does a president's interpretation of the office impact his leadership decisions? This is important. It's important for us because we have such expectations of our presidents and who they are. So we got to think about, well, what is it that we're looking for? If we're looking for somebody whose face we can carve in stone, what has to happen in order for us to do that? So I'd like each of you to formulate your own answer, and then we're going to take a couple minutes to share them.